Hey, so you want to create an AI software that can improve and get better over time and put it in your medical device, but how do you do that and keep the FDA happy? Meaning, one, once you submit it and get it approved, how can you update it and still stay within the regulations? That's what we're going to talk about today. The FDA release the marketing submission recommendations for a predetermined change control plan for AI software. This guidance document, and this is the third video, and we're on page 15 of the document. We're just reading it. So we're at figure 1, and I'll read this for you. So figure 1 is a flow chart. Decision tree says we start with, is the modification 1 specified in the description of modifications, and 2 implemented in conformance with the methods and specifications in the modification protocol of an authorized predetermined change control plan, right? PCCP, predetermined change control plan. If yes, then the document in accordance with quality system. Good. If no, then follow review of the applicable laws and regulations. Is a new marketing submission required? If yes, submit marketing submission for the modification. If no, then the document is in accordance with quality with the quality system. For the modified device to have a PCCP should be submitted with the marketing submission so that the device and the PCCP can be authorized together. And that is how you implement. This is about implementing a modification to a device with an authorized PCCP. Next, section E is modifying a PCCP with an authorized device. Because the modifications described in the PCCP include device changes that would otherwise require a PMA supplement, de novo submission, or new 510(k) pre-market notification, at this time, FDA believes that modifications to an authorized PCCP will generally constitute changes to the MLDSF that require a new marketing submission for the device, which will include the modified PCCP. In other words, FDA expects that the modified PCCP will need to be reviewed and established as part of the pre-market review of the modified device, because a modification to the PCCP will generally significantly affect the safety or effectiveness of the device. In those cases where modifications to the PCCP are the only significant modifications introduced since FDA's prior authorization for the device and its PCCP, FDA intends to focus its review on the proposed PCCP. For a manufacturer who would like to modify a PCCP for a previously authorized device with a PCCP, the marketing submission must include the appropriate marketing submission requirements for the device and the proposed PCCP. Section 5, Description of Modifications. As introduced above, a description of each plan modification to an MLDSF should be included in the Description of Modifications section of a PCCP. The detailed description should describe changes to the device characteristics and performance resulting from implementation of the modifications. To ensure an efficient review, FDA recommends that a PCCP include only a limited number of modifications that are specific and that can be verified and validated. That's to keep that review process efficient. Section A, Goals of the Description of Modifications section. A dedicated description of modification section in a PCCP identifies the specific plan modifications to the MLDSF. So that's important if you want to, plan to have some changes to your AI algorithm or whatever. So that the manufacturer intends to implement. The description of modifications draws a range of FDA-authorized specifications around the initial characteristics and performance of the device that, following the agreed-upon verification and validation described in the modification protocol, can be implemented without a new marketing submission. Yay, that's what we want. Upon FDA review of a PCCP, it is possible that FDA may determine that a modification protocol supports some but not all modifications identified in a PCCP. In such cases, only those modifications that are appropriate in the FDA's findings of substantial equivalence or reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness would be included in the authorized PCCP. Section B, Content of the Description of Modifications section. The description of modifications should enumerate the list of individual proposed device modifications discussed in the PCCP, as well as the specific rationale for the change to each part of the MLDSF that is planned to be modified. In some situations, a description of modifications will consist of multiple modifications. It may be helpful to reference the labeling changes that are associated with each modification in the description of the modification section. Such labeling changes should be included in a modification protocol as described in section 7b. FDA recommends that a PCCP include modifications that are specific and that can be verified and validated. Modifications should also be presented at a level of detail that permits understanding of the specific modifications that will be made to the MLDSF. Each modification should be linked to a specific performance evaluation activity within the modification protocol. For an example, see Table 1 in Section 7C. The description of modifications should clearly state if the planned modifications are proposed to be implemented automatically, meaning whether the modifications are implemented automatically by software, or whether modifications are implemented manually, meaning involving steps that require human input, action, review, and/or decision-making, and therefore are not implemented automatically. Understanding that this is an evolving area, FDA is proposing to consider PCCPs for MLDSFs where modifications are implemented automatically to the extent the agency can properly review them for substantial equivalence to the predicate or a reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness. The agency recognizes that this subset of MLDSFs has an additional degree of complexity. As with all MLDSFs, the FDA will consider the benefit-risk assessment and the agency's current experience applying this policy when reviewing PCCPs containing automatically implemented modifications. I think this is where it's good to have some communication with the agency or have contacts there where you can kind of figure out what the current temperature is regarding their current experience. The description of modifications should also clearly specify if the proposed modifications will be implemented in a uniform manner across all devices on the market, sometimes referred to as homogeneous or global changes or global adaptations, or implemented differently on different devices on the market based on, for example, the unique characteristics of a specific clinical site or individual patients, sometimes referred to as heterogeneous or local changes or local adaptations. For local adaptations, the description of modifications should include describing what local factors or conditions warrant a local change. C. Types of modifications. Modifications that are appropriate for a PCCP include those that are intended to maintain or improve the safety or effectiveness of the device. Modifications proposed within description of modifications should be able to be verified and validated within the existing quality system of the device. As such, not all modifications may be appropriate for inclusion within a PCCP. Types of modifications that may be acceptable within a PCCP include 1. Modifications related to quantitative measures of MLDSF performance specifications. 2. Modifications related to device inputs to the MLDSF. And 3. Limited modifications related to the device's use and performance, for example, for use within a specific subpopulation. Examples of modifications related to quantitative measures of MLDSF performance specifications include improvements to analytical and clinical performance resulting from retraining the ML model based on new data within the intended use population from the same type and range of input signal. Want to clearly understand that. Good stuff. Modifications related to device inputs to the MLDSF may involve expanding the algorithm to include new sources of the same signal type. For example, different makes, models, or versions of a data acquisition system, or limited modifications related to new types of inputs. Modifications related to the device's use and performance could include authorization of a device for a specific subset of the population within the originally indicated population based on retraining on a larger data set for that subpopulation that was not previously available. All modifications included in a PCCP must maintain the device within the device's intended use. At this time, FDA expects that modifications included in a PCCP should also maintain the device within the device's indications for use. As with modifications to the intended use, FDA believes modifications to the indications for use would not allow the device to remain safe and effective. Recognizing there is a spectrum of risk for devices, for the purposes of reviewing a PCCP, FDA intends to, among other considerations, take into account the benefit-risk profile of the specific device that is the subject of the PCCP, the specific modifications being proposed, and its experience applying this policy across different device types. See Appendix B for examples of modifications. 7. Modification protocol. The modification protocol includes the documentation describing the methods that will be followed when developing, validating, and implementing modifications delineated in the description of modification section of the PCCP. The modification protocol includes the verification and validation activities, including predefined acceptance criteria for those modifications, and is intended to provide a step-by-step delineation of how the modifications proposed in the PCCP will be implemented while assuring the device remains safe and effective. Documentation of modifications verified and validated per the modification protocol must be compliant with the quality system QS regulation. The QS regulation requires manufacturers of finished medical devices to review and approve modifications to device design and production, 21 CFR 820.30 and 8020.70, and document changes and approvals in the device master records, 21 CFR 820.8181. Section A, Goals of the Modification Protocol section. Whereas the description of modifications outlines the planned modifications to an MLDSF, the modification protocol describes the methods that will be followed when developing, validating, and implementing those modifications to ensure the device remains safe and effective. The methods described in the modification protocol should be consistent with and support the modifications outlined in the description of modifications. The goals of the modification protocol are to 1. Identify the methods and data used to develop, validate, and implement all proposed modifications. 2. Identify the test methods, data, statistical analyses, and specified acceptance criteria for all proposed modifications. 3. Ensure that the information that would otherwise be generated and submitted to the agency, meaning if the modifications were implemented on a device that did not have an authorized PCCP, will be generated by the manufacturer for each modification and maintained consistent with record-keeping requirements and in accordance with the manufacturer's QS. 4. Ensure that the risks that have been identified in the impact assessment as related to modifications detailed in the description of modifications, including the update process and communication to users, will be mitigated. And 5, lastly, be least burdensome for the manufacturer to develop and for FDA to review. This includes being traceable and specific to the modifications detailed in the description of modifications section and sufficiently comprehensive to support specific modifications. This draft guidance identifies 4 primary components of a modification protocol described below that outline a manufacturer's 1. Data management practices. 2. Retraining practices. 3. Performance evaluation protocols. And 4. Update procedures, including communication and transparency to users, and real-world monitoring plans for each modification in a PCCP. In FDA's experience, these 4 components generally provide FDA with the information needed to evaluate the PCCP. For a particular marketing submission, additional components of a modification protocol may be important to provide a reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness. In some cases, the same methods in each component of the modification protocol may support all modifications in a PCCP for a device. In other cases, the same methods in each component may not be adequate for every modification in a PCCP. It is important to note, however, that for each plan modification provided in the description of modifications, FDA recommends that each of the 4 primary components of a modification protocol be addressed. Additionally, the modification protocol should include a description of how its proposed methods are similar to or different from methods that used elsewhere in the marketing submission. For example, if the validation methods in the modification protocol represent a subset of the original testing for the device, or if the acceptance criteria for the validation are different, manufacturers should describe these differences and provide a justification. The justification for a different methodology may include references to other marketing submissions where the methodology was used for similar modifications. As noted above in section 5E, manufacturers should follow their risk management processes to develop a modification protocol that considers each modification. Upon FDA review of a PCCP, FDA may determine that the modification protocol supports some but not all proposed modifications identified in the PCCP. In such cases, only those modifications that were supportable by the proposed modification protocol would be appropriate for inclusion in the PCCP and would become part of the authorized PCCP. Those modifications that were not supportable by the proposed modification protocol or that the FDA considered inappropriate for some reasons, for example, or for other reasons, for example, the modification changes the device's indications for use, would be removed from the PCCP. All right, that's good for this video. We'll do another one. So stay tuned and thanks for listening. Take care. Bye-bye.